are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, military doctrine, and military leadership practices from which I distill lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So I want to start out today. I don't think I've mentioned this for a while. And I was having a conversation with a friend last night, and he was using a lot of war metaphors for business. And I finally stopped him and I said, business is not war. And I know there's a group of people that like to think of business as war. But for those of us who have been in the military, who have had colleagues killed in combat, maybe even have been in combat ourselves. I was not, but I certainly know people who were. The equating of business with war is it's distasteful to say the least. Um, Presumably, no one goes into a business situation with the intent of killing his competitors, right? And my friend at one point used the word enemies for competitors, and I said, I think competitors is a better word. Um, you know, Calling the people we compete with in business enemies is really going too far. I mean, to my friend's credit, he heard the argument and he ameliorated his speech, but he did say something that I thought was quite interesting, and that is, and he's in the tech world, and he's been in that that industry for at this point decades, and he thinks there's a significant percentage of people in that business who do indeed look at business as war. They look at it as an existential enterprise. And while I'll take him at his word, he knows that industry far better than I do. I do hope he's wrong. So the ideas that I bring forth here are based on the premise that I mentioned from time to time, and that is that you are my fellow citizens, have been certainly during the time, or were during the time I was in the United States Navy, and I think continue to be very supportive of the United States military, and especially the soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen that make up the various service branches. You've been very supportive of us. You spend trillions of dollars of your money, among other things, equipping and training us. And what I'm doing with this show is sort of paying you back for your support, both your financial support, of course, but also for the good treatment that we received. I grew up, I was a child during the time when the United States was fighting in Vietnam. And when I was a Boy Scout, I met uh, um, some men who had fought in Vietnam, or they were home on leave and had to go back. And they were not nearly as well treated. In fact, in many cases, they were badly treated compared to how service members of my time in the military have been treated. And so that's what this is all about. But I do not in any way, shape, or form think that business is an existential enterprise, and I frankly condemn that idea. Um, I get it that drug lords and others involved in criminal activity, they will and at least in some cases, blithely kill other people to meet their business objectives. That's flat out criminal activity. But in the legitimate business world, I strongly advocate for not using the language of writers like Sun Tzu and others, uh, in terms of the kinetic combat type language in describing what we do in business. We have competitors, not enemies. We don't go into battle. We don't combat our competitors. Yes, we use tactics. Tactics is a rather neutral word. We do use strategy, again, a rather neutral word. But we are not trying to, God forbid, kill our enemies in business. We are trying to outcompete our competitors, and I hope that um, you'll take this to heart, keep it in mind, as you hopefully also continue to watch these shows for ideas that we can get from like today we're going to be talking about Captain John Paul Jones, one of the legends of the United States Navy, from the American War for Independence. So I hope we'll be inspired by you'll be inspired by his courage, his leadership, and when I talk about the business lessons we can learn from his victory at Flamborough, that you'll realize it's taken in the spirit of being a more resilient competitor, not to bring forth the idea that business is war. Business is not war. Okay, so I felt compelled to say that in light of this discussion I had with my friend yesterday. So today's um, episode is I am going to be talking about John Paul Jones's victory at Flamborough Head. Just a little bit of background on John Paul Jones. He was born in 1747 in Scotland, and he went to sea at the age of 13. Now you may say, wow, that's really young. Actually, that wasn't particularly young for someone to go to sea in the 18th century. There were boys even younger than that on ships. You had a position called a powder monkey. I know that sounds horrible. It was just a boy who carried powder charges from the magazine to the cannons. They had to be small to get into the small spaces where these powder charges were held. And midshipmen oftentimes were in 12, 13, 14 years old. Sometimes they were older, of course, but it wasn't unusual for them to be as young as John Paul Jones was. Uh, and universal schooling was not a thing yet. Number one. Number two, families needed to be able to live, and so families were typically larger then than they are now, certainly. And so children, or what we would call children, work. They might work on the family farm, or they might be apprenticed at a very young age into some kind of trade or profession. In this case, we're talking about John Paul Jones joining the Navy. So early in his career, in his um, late teens and early 20s, he commanded merchant ships, and he later worked as a privateer. I've talked about privateering on this show before. Privateering is kind of a legal form of piracy, and through those activities, he learned, especially the privateering, he learned the art of naval combat, and commerce raiding, that he used so effectively during the American War for Independence. In 1775, at the outbreak of the American Revolution, so John Paul Jones volunteered for what was then called the Continental Navy. So he quickly gained fame for raiding British shipping in the Atlantic and the Irish Sea. He commanded a small squadron of a squadron, I should say, a small squadron of small vessels, often taking very bold risks. One might even consider them almost foolhardy. But this was also part of the sort of the esprit de, not the esprit de corps, the just the sort of way of naval commanders of that time. To gain a reputation for being audacious was what they sought to do. And he certainly, John Paul Jones certainly earned his reputation. So by 1779, okay, the American Revolution had been going on for several years at that point. He was in a French port, and he was commanding a ship known as the USS Bonhomme Richard. Okay, yes, it's a French name. It was a former French East Indiaman that had been converted into a warship. It's one of the most storied names for a ship in the United States Navy. I think most recently, I think there's still a USS Bonhomme Richard. I believe it's like an LHD, which is sort of a ship that the U.S. Navy uses for transporting Marine Corps units. There was at one time an aircraft carrier called the USS Bonhomme Richard, and its armament included 42 guns, cannons, and I believe some carronades as well. But because the ship started out as an East Indiaman, and so was built to maximize the amount of cargo it could hold, as opposed to speed and maneuverability, the Bonhomme Richard was not well suited for certainly for not the kind of naval warfare that went on at the time, what was called a line of battle fight. It was slower and less maneuverable than the British warships of the day. So, setting the stage for the Battle of Flamborough Head, the battle took place on September 23rd, 1779. Okay, so what, about 236 years ago? And Flamborough Head is located off the Yorkshire coast in England. So Yorkshire is located on the east coast of England, kind of north, certainly north of the Thames and London. It's not all the way to the border with Scotland, but it's I think closer to the Scottish border than it is to the Thames. So John Paul Jones commanded an American squadron that included his flagship, the Bonhomme Richard. It also included the USS Alliance and two smaller vessels. So 4 ships in all. The British squadron consisted of the HMS Serapis, which was a 44-gun, heavily armed frigate, and the Countess of Scarborough, which was a smaller escort ship. So you would say, wow, that was a pretty unbalanced battle, 2-1. The Royal Navy was very, very proud of its ability to take on a larger force and still become victorious. And indeed, the HMS Serapis was a vastly superior ship for combat, at least, than the USS Bonhomme Richard. So Jones's goal was to raid British shipping and disrupt commerce. But, generally speaking, he was up against British, merchantmen. Going up against the HMS Serapis meant essentially full-blown combat. So the battle began with the Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis closing to within range. That's within the range of how far their cannons could reach. And the British ship, which was faster and more maneuverable, it opened fire and pretty quickly started battering the Bonhomme Richard. Um, it was, like as I said a moment ago, it was just overall a vastly superior ship. Um, and pretty quickly, Jones's ship was heavily damaged. The rigging was torn, the sails were shredded, and the hull had been shot through so many times it was leaking. And Jones realized that he could not survive this kind of cannon firing battle, that he was going to be defeated if he kept up, if he continued to essentially play the British ships, play into the British ships strategy, which was to outmaneuver the Bonhomme Richard and basically just pound it to the point where um, it either had to give up, or it was sunk. So Jones made the clearly audacious decision to essentially um, use what way he had left on the Bonhomme Richard to come within grappling distance of the Serapis, and then he had his men throw grappling hooks from his ship to the British ship and essentially tied them together. And so while the cannons did continue to fire, they were much less effective because there's no way to get a cannon firing at a steep enough angle down to hold the ship below the water line without seriously endangering the gun crew of that cannon. And that was part of the strategy of grappling the ships together. Was it dramatically reduced the effectiveness of the Serapis gunnery. And so, having locked the two ships together, and while the cannons continued to fire at essentially point blank range, and Marines in the mass of the ship were firing muskets across the decks, they would, generally speaking, try to kill the officers, right? So, because a leaderless crew was much less effective. So, as the battle sort of ranged in that way, Jones's ship, the Bonhomme Richard, began to sink, and in fact was in danger of going down. And it was at this point that the commander of the British ship, demanded that Jones surrender, and Jones, his reported famous reply was, "I have not yet begun to fight." And this has become an absolutely legendary event in American naval history. And indeed, whether those are the exact words or not, they definitely inspired the crew of the American ship. And so, to turn the tide, John Paul Jones led his crew in boarding the Serapis, and the fight was essentially hand-to-hand combat: swords, pikes, um, the short wooden posts that were put into the deck railing, around which the various running rigging of the ship were tied. They would take those, and so the crew of the Bonhomme Richard got on board the Serapis, and again, the fighting was hand to hand. The battle raged for another 3 hours, and the American crew outfought the British crew, and eventually the Serapis was forced to strike her colors, which means lower her flag, and that signaled the surrender of the British squadron, the two ships. And so John Paul Jones and his crew emerged victorious. They really snatched victory out of what looked like certain defeat. And it's why this battle goes down in history as being so legendary. So, in the aftermath of the battle, the Bonhomme Richard did end up sinking a few days later, and it just could not be salvaged. There was no way to tow it. First of all, they couldn't tow it to a British port. They would have been, captured and imprisoned, and they were not going to get it all the way back to France, given the condition it was in. The Americans captured the Serapis, and they ended up. It was in pretty bad shape as well, but they were able to tow it into port, and it became not only a major victory but a major propaganda victory among both the Americans and the French. So during the American Revolution, although England and France were not in active war, they were by no means allies. They remained geopolitical enemies, and so that the Americans had emerged victorious over the English was a cause for French celebration. So the significance of the battle was on several levels. First of all, strategically, it demonstrated that even in British waters, this nascent American Navy, it had only been around for a few years at that point. Back in the 1970s, as I mentioned in my show yesterday on Navy Day, in the 1970s, the founding date of the United States Navy was set at October 13, 1775. So at this point, the Continental Navy was, essentially 4 years old, up against the strongest naval power in the world. And they could go into the American Navy could go into British waters, and they could achieve victory. So it was stunning on some level for the Royal Navy, as well as the rest of the world, to hear that this is what the Americans had done. It was a moral victory in that it inspired Americans, certainly, but also the French and other Europeans by proving that the colonies were not defenseless at sea. And this was important because the nascent United States of America needed allies. They needed the French, and other countries to supply them with the materiel of war, and nations were oftentimes reluctant to do so if they thought that the party seeking that kind of support was not going to be victorious. Why support a loser, basically, right? So John Paul Jones's victory showed that the U.S. Navy could fight ship to ship, basically, and could be victorious. It also the battle also showed the tactical innovation. May be too strong a word, because John Paul Jones was not the first one to use the boarding of a ship to achieve victory. Certainly, navies and pirates had been doing it before, but the idea of using grappling hooks and tying the two ships together and really sort of staking one's all on boarding an enemy's ship and defeating it, that was bolder than was certainly typically, if not ever, seen before. And so typically, if there was a boarding party, they would board the ship, but the ship from which they came might stand off to sort of live to fight another day. And then finally, John Paul Jones became a legend in his own time. He became a symbol of courage, of unyielding determination in naval warfare, and even beyond that, he inspired Americans in general in their fight for independence from England. So, just some interesting details. The Bonhomme Richard lost 30 to 50 of her crewmen. While that is a somewhat large number, if the ship had sunk, of course, the loss would have been much, much greater. And indeed, the Serapis suffered much heavier losses than the Bonhomme Richard. Um, the weapons used, as I mentioned a little while ago, included cannons, muskets, grenades, swords. I mean, it was as basically as broad a variety of weapons as square rigged wooden ships carried in those days. And it is notable, and I'm repeating this. Jones led the boarding crew, right? He put himself in personal danger, and risking his life, and that was, inspiring to his crew, that he wasn't sitting back and saying, "You go fight while I have my tea," or whatever. He was willing to take the same risks that they took. There was a cultural impact to Jones's victory at Flamborough Head, including it inspired poems and paintings. If you saw any of the promotions for any of the social media promotions for this episode, you saw one of the paintings, and really, it was a significant uh, peg, if you will, in the development of American naval traditions. So, let's take a break here, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about some of the lessons. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. So, if you noticed in the background of that sponsor spot, there was a ship that was indeed LHD 6, the Bonhomme Richard. That's why I had it in my mind that was the case. So there you go. You got to see the most recent version of this storied name. So I came up with 6 lessons that we can learn from John Paul Jones's victory at Flamborough Head. And number 1 is turn weakness into strategy. So when your resources are limited, change the rules of engagement. So, as I mentioned, the Bonhomme Richard was slower, weaker, less maneuverable than the Serapis, and so instead of fighting at a distance, he closed in. John Paul Jones closed in, grappled the ships together, and turned the battle into one of individual courage and manpower as opposed to firepower. He certainly even though he had 42 guns to 44, the gunnery of the Bonhomme Richard was just not as strong, and the weight of shot that the Bonhomme Richard could fire was not as great as Serapis, and so uh, Jones realized, pretty quickly that he was not going to be able to win victory that way, and so he realized he needed to change his strategy. So in business, it's oftentimes that we have larger competitors who have more market power, and they have greater capitalization. Maybe they have a larger team than we have, and we're not going to be able to compete with them based on the relative size of our resources. And so, if we're small, we're going to have to learn to be more creative, more agile, more scrappy. It's such a great word. It sounds like what it means, right? And I know from my own history in business when I had my real estate company. So uh, I um, I did a very complex real estate appraisals, the kind of work that was almost never done by the small firm that I had. It was usually much larger firms did the work, and the way I was able to be successful was by being much more responsive to my clients' needs. There were times when they needed a report turned around in as little as 48 hours. Okay, no large appraisal company would commit to doing work that quickly while maintaining a high level of quality of work. And there were times when I maybe, in a 48-hour period, I may have slept for 4 or 5 hours, and that included, flying to a destination where a property was located, and doing all of the work, doing the research, and then just, staying up almost literally all night drafting the report to get it to the client. And the clients appreciated that because they were competing against other lenders. And so to be able to respond to a potential borrower more quickly gave them a competitive advantage. And so that I was able to be more agile, be more specifically customer responsive, gave them the ability to be more competitive. And so they looked to me, as opposed to a larger firm, for that kind of work. And so I could outcompete my larger, better capitalized, larger teamed competitors, and be successful. Okay, so number one, turn weakness into strategy. Number two, refuse to quit when the odds are against you. So perseverance under pressure sometimes, maybe oftentimes, creates breakthroughs. And I would argue that when things are going well, and we're feeling pretty comfortable, we're probably not motivated to look for breakthroughs. We should be, but oftentimes we're not, especially if we have small businesses. So when Jones, as I related in the history of Flamborough Head, when he was called on to surrender, he said, "I have not yet begun to fight." And I think that we have to have a similar level of resolve. So times right now are the business climate. I think it's less chaotic now than it was earlier in the year, but there's still considerable uncertainty of what's going to happen. We're not getting the kind of regular economic data for the last month that we're used to getting. Um, Tariffs still remain an uncertainty how they're going to play out. If they're going to play out, will the Supreme Court overturn the tariff regimes that the Trump administration has put into place? And if so, how will the administration respond to that? So all of these create uncertainty, and yet uh, we as business people need to persevere, and we need to find ways to deal with the uncertainty and still be successful, still be prosperous. And many firms, it turns out, are doing that. So if you've been listening to earnings reports, if you've been listening to the discussions undergirding the earnings reports and the projected earnings, so many companies are coming out and saying that The initial assessment of the impact of tariffs, for example, is not as great as it was, or as it's not as great as they had at first anticipated, maybe 4, 5, 6 months ago. And so they're able to be they've been able to generate better earnings than they thought. There are companies like UPS was reported this. United Parcel Service, UPS, reported their earnings this morning, and their earnings exceeded estimates. Their revenue exceeded estimates, and that was partly due to the CEO of the company realizing that he had to streamline operations, and it looks like that strategy has been very successful. So whether you're a small, scrappy company like mine, whether you're a large multinational company like UPS, we have to refuse to quit even when the odds are against us. And we need to inspire our people, our team members, to do the same thing, because one person in a company can't overcome the challenges of the market and business competition. But as a team, we certainly can. Okay, so number 3, we need to inspire relentless commitment, right? So leadership is first and foremost about conviction to the goal, the purpose, the mission of a company, and to inspiring others to follow in reaching that goal, that mission, that fulfill the purpose of that company. That's fundamentally what leadership is about. And we see John Paul Jones exhibiting exemplary leadership at Flamborough Head because he had to make the quick, decisive decisions to change the strategy in the battle. But also, when it came time to, where the rubber hits the road, as they say, he led his men over the railing in launching that hand-to-hand combat that through which the Americans, after several hours, reigned victorious. And it was that kind of audacious action and self-confidence that inspired his crew and convinced them that if the captain believes we're going to win, then indeed we can win. John Paul Jones had unshakable confidence, and his unshakable confidence became the source of the courage of his crew. So when we are leading an enterprise, a business, a nonprofit, a professional practice, right, how we approach things is largely going to determine how the other members of our team approach the business, right? So if we don't think we can be successful, almost assuredly we will not be. If we're facing headwinds, and then as leaders, we need to project self-confidence. We need to project resilience. And in doing so, but we need to do it in a way that will inspire our other team members to follow our example and to relentlessly commit, not just to following our leadership, although that's part of it, but be themselves relentlessly committed to accomplishing the mission, to fulfilling the purpose. Okay, next, number 4, we need to adapt in real time. Okay, business, the speed at which business happens today is much faster than it was even when I started in business, now going back close to 40 years ago. And in fact, next year, 2026, it won't be my 40th year in business because I took some time off to be in the Navy, but it'll be 40 years since I started my first company. And the pace of business in the 1980s was nowhere near as fast as it is now. And the competition is much more innovative and flexible, even among large companies, than it was 40 years ago. And tools like large language models, like AI automation, all of these allow companies of all sizes to adapt much more quickly than has ever been the case. So, uh, this is a skill that we need to learn and constantly, consistently improve. So, going back to John Paul Jones in his battle, as I mentioned in the history, he saw pretty quickly that his battle plan was not going to be successful. And so he adapted, shifting from a strategy of gunnery to a strategy of boarding, where he was not outgunned, but where leadership and the courage of his crew would be set against that of the officers and sailors of the Serapis, right? And that was why, in the end, they were able to be victorious. So, in going back to business, then market conditions change continually. Competitors are also changing constantly. So the successful business is the leader, is the business that has leadership that is looking to adjust quickly, to seize opportunities, to see where troubles may be brewing ahead, and will tack left or right in order to avoid those difficulties. And having made a change, will be equally decisive about making further changes if they're necessary. And indeed, staying competitive in business on some level can be exhausting these days. It seems like there is no opportunity for downtime, and so I'm not going to get into that as part of this discussion, but we as business people, we as leaders of businesses, we do need to be very attentive to our own physical, mental, and spiritual health, so that we can maintain our resilience and have the ability to adapt in real time. That's number 4. Number 5, value symbolic victories. So oftentimes perception is as important as performance. Okay. So, excuse me. Indeed, winning a ship to ship battle, it was just one ship to ship battle, between John Paul Jones's USS Bonhomme Richard and the HMS Serapis. In the grand scheme of things, it was a pretty modest victory, but the symbolic impact of it was much, much larger. That the scrappy Americans defeated a ship of the most powerful navy in the world at that time was something truly of note. And the propaganda victory, or the propaganda value of the victory, more precisely stated, was probably more important than the victory itself. The fact that the Serapis was captured, okay, one fewer British warship, but the Bonhomme Richard sank, so the American Navy, they ended up with a ship that, at least when it started, was a better ship than the U.S. Bonhomme Richard, but required a lot of work to get it back into sailing trim, right? And the British lost one ship out of hundreds that they had, not a significant loss. But that they had lost in a straight up ship to ship fight was of tremendous impact, in what eventually became the American victory in the War for Independence. And so, in business too, sometimes we have to look at where we can make ground in a way that will inspire our people, that will demonstrate to the larger market our ability, and will bring to us accolades that maybe they're in excess of what was really won, but nonetheless, they bring the kind of accolades to our business that will help us expand, grow, and inspire our teams. And trying to think of a quick example of this. From what I've heard in the news recently, I had it in the back of my head and now it's gone away. Uh, again, if you're following current business news, uh, both Apple and I don't remember what the other company is, but two major tech companies now have over $4 trillion market capitalizations. $4 trillion. I remember when to hear the word billion used in a business context was just mind blowing. And now we talk about trillions. And I think while in a way, okay, trillions, what does it really mean? Nobody owns all those trillion, no individual owns those trillions of dollars. Okay, yeah, sure. On the other hand, to be part of an enterprise that has reached a valuation unheard of in human history, I think has to be inspiring. And so, for whatever market challenges Apple has, there's no doubting that there's a public relations victory in having such a tremendously large market capitalization. So the value of that symbolic victory, if you will, I think is notable. And I would imagine that Tim Cook is using that to inspire not just his senior executives who, because they have stock options or whatever, may directly financially benefit from the increase in value of the company to such a lofty level, but just the sort of more rank and file people working at Apple who should be proud of helping build such a successful organization. And finally, build alliances that expand businesses, that expand your reach. So partnership amplifies power. The squadron that John Paul Jones commanded, it included French ships. It had a multinational crew, which wasn't particularly unusual for the time. Often ships had sailors on board from many nations. Even the Royal Navy had ships with sailors that weren't English, although the vast majority of their sailors were. And John Paul Jones's cooperation with France in getting his ships fitted out in French ports meant that he was able to take the fight to England much more effectively and efficiently than if he had to go back to American ports, sail all the way across the Atlantic, all the way back across the Atlantic. So the partnership that he was able to build with French officials meant that he could be much more effective and much bolder in his commerce raiding. And so I think this is an area that small businesses uh, 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 don't on which small businesses don't focus enough. We often, perhaps, I don't know about often, but I think there's a tendency perhaps to think that, oh, alliances, those are for large companies. So I was listening to an airline ad earlier today, and I think United Airlines was touting their alliance with Air Italia or whoever it was, right? And they were touting on how close it was and how efficiently they worked together and how good that was for their passengers and kind of blah 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 blah. Okay, I'll take them at their word. I mean, I don't. I don't fly these days, but there's no doubt that things like code sharing allows airlines to operate more efficiently, and rather than duplicating routes, they can provide more seamless service to their passengers by having alliances between different airlines, as opposed to just having, you know, trying to cover every route within one airline. And so, I think we're used to understanding that. I think less understood is how we as small businesses can create alliances. So I'll give you an example. uh, Sunday before last, I was invited to SoFi Stadium, which is the beautiful new sports stadium in Inglewood, which is just south of the city of Los Angeles. It really is an impressive uh, engineering work. If you haven't been there, all I can say is go check it out, even if you only go once. And A business colleague of mine, a fellow by the name of Andrew Nutbrown, who's an estate planning attorney, invited me to go, and I got to meet some of his colleagues and some of the other clients of the firm. And I met a young man there who works for a home healthcare company. They provide RNs and other individuals who can take care of people in their homes. It could be 24-hour a day care. It can be just needing visits periodically to administer medications or whatever it is. And he mentioned to me that he was thinking about becoming a professional fiduciary, which is what I do. And we started talking, and I mentioned to him that, as a and he was looking, he's already involved in the client care side in what he's doing. He sells the services, he doesn't do the client care himself. He's not an RN, but he's already involved in that side of it. That's what he knows, is how to take care of people. He doesn't know the financial side of a conservatorship or a guardianship. And I said to him, the one thing I would say is, if you are going to become a professional fiduciary, you need to make sure that you're handling the financial side of being a fiduciary as competently as the client care side. And he said, "Well, I don't have any experience in that." And kind of half joking, I said to him, "Well, we could always team up, because I only handle the financial side. I don't do client care. So, we could team up, and you could handle that side and I can handle this side, and we can both do what we do well and be a powerful duo." And he loved that idea. So, we scheduled a meeting next week or two to talk about this. And the fact of the matter is, we would be much stronger allied than we would be individually. We would be more than two, in essence. The sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So that's where I think we who have small businesses really need to look for those kinds of situations. So I have a similar alliance with my friend uh, Bill Gross, who's one of the top probate real estate agents in the country. So Bill and I work together on lots of projects. And perhaps even more importantly, we back each other up, so that where he's not as strong, I tend to be strong, and vice versa. And so, again, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts when Bill and I work together. And so those are the kinds of alliances that will expand our reach, expand our profitability, and make our businesses and our professional practices more successful. So those are the lessons that we can learn from John Paul Jones's victory at Flamborough Head. Real quickly, just reviewing them: turn weakness into a strategy, refuse to quit even when the odds are against you, inspire relentless commitment, adapt in real time, value symbolic victories, and finally, build alliances that expand your reach. So, if we can do those things, we will indeed be much more successful in business. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Always, Jeet, got some live viewers on. Thank you very much for joining me. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And then on, wait, let me double check my calendar so I'm not telling you the wrong thing. Yeah, and tomorrow is my last show for this week. So hopefully I'll see you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And in the meantime, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my best.